Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, fluff the pillows, maybe release that one very stubborn breath you've been holding since like 3 p.m. Tonight, we're going to drift. Not walk, not power stride, but drift through the architectural history of New York. And yes, I know, architecture doesn't sound like something you can fall asleep to, but trust me, once we start talking about Dutch gables and early American rooflines, your brain is going to slide straight into sleepy mode. So, settle in, let gravity gently win, and let's wander through a city that's basically one giant museum of why does this building look like that, with a side of who thought that was a good idea. And as always, don't worry. Nothing shocking is going to happen. No sudden plot twists, no dramatic soundtrack, just calm, mildly sarcastic commentary about a city where skyscrapers sprout like overly ambitious weeds. Let's begin way, way back. The Dutch phase, when New York was basically a brick potato. So, tonight's journey starts long before New York was even New York. Before the skyline had more glass than a modern aquarium, before every other street corner had a coffee shop pretending to be artisanal. In the early 1600s, the place we now call New York City was a quiet-ish Dutch outpost called New Amsterdam. And when I say quiet-ish, I mean it in the historical sense, which is to say, a bunch of Europeans showed up, did the classic European thing of claiming land that wasn't theirs, and then built structures that absolutely screamed, "We are from Northern Europe and we don't care that the climate here is different." Dutch architecture of the time was, well, very Dutch. Think steep roofs that looked like they were trying to escape the ground. Think brick facades with those cute stepped gables, which were basically just architectural eyebrows saying, "Yes, we tried. Kind of." Most of the early houses were made of wood at first, because that was faster and the settlers weren't exactly known for their patience. But after a few fires, and because wooden houses and 17th century fireplaces are a dangerous combo, the Dutch began shifting to more brick construction. Brick was sturdy. Brick was safe. Brick was also heavy and annoying to import, but, priorities. One of the most iconic features they loved was the overhanging stoop. Yes, the famous New York stoop has very Dutch origins. And no, the Dutch settlers weren't standing there sipping oat milk lattes while talking about property values. They used stoops mainly because it raised the entrance above the muddy, occasionally sewage-flavored streets. Very practical, very charming, very, please don't let this gross water get into my house. Another fun fact to lull you deeper into the pillow, windows in early Dutch New York often had shutters painted in bright, contrasting colors, usually red, white, or green, because apparently the apocalypse-level gray of the North Sea followed them mentally everywhere. These buildings were small, cozy, and extremely unimpressed with themselves, which is a vibe that New York architecture will lose very quickly. Let's drift a little farther. The English show up and immediately change the aesthetic. So, the Dutch had a good run. A peaceful little architectural party of bricks and gables and stubborn practicality. And then the English showed up in 1664, did the classic English colonial thing of politely saying, "This is ours now," and suddenly New Amsterdam became New York. English architecture at the time leaned heavily into styles like Georgian, which is basically what happens when a perfectionist decides that buildings should have symmetry so rigid you could use the floor plans as a ruler. English New York architecture became clean, orderly, and deeply committed to the aesthetic of both windows must match or I'll cry. Georgian buildings liked brick too, but they were more predictable, more formal. Imagine the kind of house that would scold you for wearing muddy shoes in the hallway. This era introduced central doorways, framed by neat little columns, perfectly aligned windows, hipped roofs, which look like someone gently pressed down on the top of the house, sash windows, also known as those windows that slide up and down in every historical movie ever. Things got tidier, more British, a little snobbier. And so the architectural personality of New York began its first identity crisis. On one side, Dutch practicality. On the other, English symmetry. And in the middle, a bunch of colonists who just wanted a house that wouldn't leak. Let's float forward again. Early Manhattan, a patchwork quilt of "we tried." So, as the 1700s rolled on, New York's architecture became increasingly varied, mostly because the population exploded, everyone arrived with their own idea of what a house should look like, and there was no official zoning because zoning hadn't been invented yet. Which meant the city looked like a bit like a medieval Pinterest board where every user pinned a different century. Some neighborhoods leaned Dutch, some leaned English, some leaned whatever materials we could find before winter gets here. So you might have seen a Dutch-style house with a roof that looked like an unfolded paper fortune teller, a Georgian townhouse trying its best to look aristocratic, and a random wooden shack in between them, contributing absolutely nothing to the architectural conversation. It was charming. In that way, early colonial cities are always charming, full of mud, smoke, livestock, and people deeply pretending everything is under control. One important building from this era was Francis Tavern, originally built around 1719, which still stands today. It's seen so many reconstructions that it's basically 10% original material and 90% historical wish thinking. But it gives us a taste of early 18th century New York architecture. Simple bricks, pitched roofs, dormer windows, and a vibe that says, I'm a respectable building, but also please don't look too closely at my foundation. Let's drift a bit farther down the timeline. Federal style. America tries to look grown up. So, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, New York began developing a taste for the federal style. Think of this as Georgian architecture that's been to therapy, learned boundaries, and lost a little weight. Federal buildings were slimmer, cleaner, more delicate, fond of elliptical fan lights over doors because apparently geometry was fashionable. Federal-style homes in New York were usually brick townhouses with 3 or 4 floors, tall windows, and ironwork that tried hard to look fancy but cost significantly less than it looked. And in classic early American fashion, architects borrowed heavily from classical Roman and Greek ideas, because what screams, young, independent nation, more than copying the homework of civilizations from 2,000 years earlier? Let's float to another moment in New York's endless architectural mood swings. The grid plan. A city decided to become a spreadsheet. Now, if there's one moment that changed New York architecture forever, it's the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. Before this, Manhattan streets were chaotic and meandering, little lanes left over from Dutch days, English days, and days when no one knew what the word planning meant. But in 1811, the city said, absolutely not. We are done. We need structure, we need order, we need a grid so precise it will haunt urban planners for centuries. And so the famous numbered streets and avenues were born. Was the grid graceful? Not really. Was it convenient? Extremely. Was it a bit of a personality shift? Oh, yes. Because New York's new grid didn't care about topography. It didn't care about old houses. It didn't care that some of the streets it erased had been around longer than the country itself. It just plowed forward like a colonial Roomba. And because of this, architecture in the city became more uniform. Townhouses lined up neatly, blocks became predictable, and the city slowly transformed into that long rectangular prism we all know and navigate using numbers instead of basic human intuition. Let's drift further. Greek Revival. when New York went through its ancient Greece phase. It happens to everyone at some point. Some people get way too into astrology, some start baking sourdough. New York, around the 1830s, got very into ancient Greek architecture. This was the Greek Revival era, and it swept through the city like a slow, marble-scented fever dream. Suddenly, everyone wanted columns, heavy cornices, white facades trying to look like actual stone, pediments that said Athens but make it affordable. Why Greek? Because America associated itself with democracy, and ancient Greece was the ultimate branding partner for that vibe. It was all very symbolic and very on trend. This era gave the city buildings like Federal Hall, rebuilt in 1842, serving heavy, please imagine I'm made of marble, even. This is the part of the story where New York architecture goes from quaint to let me be taller than all of my peers so I can feel something. The skyscraper era, the industrial age glow-up, the architectural equivalent of a growth spurt that never ends. Let's drift in slowly. Industrial confidence, when New York went through its steel can fix everything phase. We're now in the late 19th century. The city is booming. Immigrants are arriving by the thousands. Streets are getting noisier. Markets are exploding. And the buildings, well, they're absolutely done with being short. Traditional construction, brick walls, wooden structures, low ceilings, was holding everyone back. Developers wanted height, but brick walls get absurdly thick the taller you build, like 4 feet thick at the base thick, which is not ideal unless you're constructing a medieval fortress. But then came structural steel. Lightweight, strong, flexible enough to handle New York weather, which alternates between frozen misery and humid disappointment. Suddenly, builders could stack floors like pancakes without worrying that the bottom ones would crumble like wet cardboard. And that changed everything. The first recognizable skyscrapers began appearing around the 1870s and 1880s, though they were still adorable by modern standards, 10 to 20 floors. This is the part of the story where New York architecture goes from quaint to let me be taller than all of my peers so I can feel something. The skyscraper era, the industrial age glow-up, the architectural equivalent of a growth spurt that never ends. Let's drift in slowly. Industrial confidence, when New York went through its steel can fix everything phase. We're now in the late 19th century. The city is booming. Immigrants are arriving by the thousands. Streets are getting noisier. Markets are exploding. And the buildings? Well, they're absolutely done with being short. Traditional construction, brick walls, wooden structures, low ceilings, was holding everyone back. Developers wanted height, but brick walls get absurdly thick the taller you build, like 4 feet thick at the base thick, which is not ideal unless you're constructing a medieval fortress. But then came structural steel. Lightweight, strong, flexible enough to handle New York weather, which alternates between frozen misery and humid disappointment. Suddenly, builders could stack floors like pancakes without worrying that the bottom ones would crumple like wet cardboard, and that changed everything. The first recognizable skyscrapers began appearing around the 1870s and 1880s, though they were still adorable by modern standards, 10 to 20 floors, baby skyscrapers, architectural toddlers taking their first steps upward. Let's drift towards some examples. The Tribune Building, New York's first "look how tall I am" moment. Standing in Lower Manhattan, constructed in 1875, the Tribune Building was innovative for its time. It stood around 260 feet, which back then was considered shockingly tall. Today, a mediocre apartment building in Queens can do that half asleep, but in the 1870s, this was big news. It had a mansard roof, because architects in the 19th century absolutely loved pretending they were in Paris, and a clock tower that just screamed, "I want to be noticed." The facade was elaborate, full of Renaissance revival vibes, arches, and a general air of, "We are a newspaper, but we want to look like a palace anyway." It was also one of the earliest attempts at using steel and iron in a way that allowed the building to rise higher without collapsing. A bit experimental, a bit fragile, the architectural equivalent of a teenager trying on a suit for the first time. But the city was hooked. Tall buildings were the future. Let's drift to another early contender. The World Building. When New York briefly thought it had hit peak height. In 1890, the World Building, also called the Pulitzer Building, rose into the skyline at an then astounding 309 feet. Yes, you heard that right, 309. And the city basically fainted from excitement. Of course, it had a giant dome on top. Domes were very serious building energy. The bigger the dome, the more respectable you seemed. This tradition goes back centuries. Humans see a dome and immediately think, ah, yes, important things happen there. The World Building didn't last. It was demolished in the 1950s to make room for a freeway because mid-century planners had the aesthetic sensitivity of a sledgehammer. But at the time, it was a huge stepping stone. It proved that New York wasn't just playing with height, it was committing. And once New York commits to something, well, good luck stopping it. Let's float toward the turn of the century. The Flatiron, New York's first drama triangle. Now, we move to 1902 when something magical and unintentionally hilarious appeared on the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, the Flatiron Building. People had never really seen a triangular skyscraper before. It looked like someone had taken a perfectly normal building and squeezed it in a hydraulic press from one side. Flat, dramatic, and obviously self-conscious about its angles. Architect Daniel Burnham designed the Flatiron using steel frame construction, which meant the walls were not the structure, they were just decoration. That allowed the building to stretch up to 20 stories and take on its now iconic shape, a narrow wedge cutting into the city like a steel pie slice. New Yorkers thought the building might literally fall over in strong wind. Some newspaper vendors refused to stand near it. People called it Burnham's Folly. But it held firm, and today it's one of the most beloved shapes in the city. The Flatiron is early skyscraper energy distilled into one dramatic triangle. Ambitious, unusual, slightly confused, and doing its best. Let's keep drifting. Beaux-Arts Manhattan, when buildings dressed for the ball. The early 20th century brought a flood, an absolute tidal wave of Beaux-Arts architecture. If you've ever walked by a building in New York and thought, why does this look like a French opera house that lost its way? That's Beaux-Arts. This style is basically architecture shouting, I must look magnificent even if I have zero reason to be this fancy. Beaux-Arts buildings in New York were big, grand, decorative to the point of mild exhaustion, plastered with sculptures, columns, cartouches, and other features no one asked for. Some iconic examples include the New York Public Library with its famous stone lions, Grand Central Terminal, which is a building so pretty it's almost passive-aggressive, the original Penn Station, which is the architectural equivalent of that gorgeous vase your grandmother owned before someone smashed it to make room for something practical and boring. Beaux-Arts arrived because wealthy industrialists wanted the city to look like it belonged in Europe. New York had money now, it had swagger. And nothing says swagger than a 200-foot stone facade pretending it's in Paris. Let's float into even taller territory.
Early skyscraper personality shift, the setback laws. By the 1910s, skyscrapers were getting taller and chunkier. Manhattan was beginning to feel like a canyon, with buildings blocking sunlight and turning streets into permanent twilight zones. Then, in 1916, the city introduced new zoning laws requiring setbacks, meaning that once a building reached a certain height, it had to step back from the street and create a tiered form, like a giant wedding cake sculpted by an architect with a geometry obsession. Why? Because New Yorkers occasionally like sunlight, believe it or not. These setback rules created the distinctive ziggurat or layered look you see in early skyscrapers. Tall at the base, narrower as they climb, and crowned with decorative spires or roofs. This paved the way for some of the most iconic New York silhouettes. Let's drift upward. The Chrysler Building, Art Deco royalty. We're now entering the Art Deco era, which is easily one of the most beloved architectural periods in New York. It's sleek, it's glamorous, it's obsessed with geometry and metal and speed, basically the architectural embodiment of roaring 20s energy. But nothing captures this vibe more than the Chrysler Building. Completed in 1930, it stood briefly as the tallest building in the world, and it knew it. Oh, it knew. The Chrysler Building is pure stylized drama. A tapering crown made of stainless steel, fan-shaped arches that sparkle with sunlight, racing-inspired ornamentation, including actual metal replicas of Chrysler car hood ornaments, eagles peering dramatically from the corners like they're auditioning for a Gothic reboot. The whole thing looks like an Art Deco tiara perched on the skyline. It wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a shiny, metallic, look at me moment in architectural history. Let's float slightly forward. The Empire State Building, the quiet giant that won the height race. And then came the Empire State Building, completed in 1931, tall, sturdy, unbothered, a little emotionally distant, classic New York energy. At 1,250 feet, not counting the antenna, it became the tallest building in the world, and it held that title for nearly 40 years. That's basically forever in skyscraper time. Unlike the Chrysler Building, which is glamorous and sparkly, the Empire State Building is minimal, serious. It looks like a perfectly respectable stack of stone and steel wearing a business suit. Some fun bedtime facts. It was built fast, just over a year.
Tonight, we're gliding into the postmodern era. The decades when New York looked at its shiny, efficient skyscrapers and said, what if we brought back personality? Not too much personality, just a sprinkle. Let's drift softly into the 1970s and 1980s. Postmodernism, when buildings started craving attention again. After years of minimalist international-style boxes, architects started getting bored or restless. Or maybe they collectively realized that endless glass rectangles are, in fact, a little emotionally draining. So by the 1970s and 1980s, postmodernism crept in, slowly, like a cat deciding whether or not to sit on your lap. Postmodern architecture was basically a reaction to modernism's straight-faced seriousness. Designers now wanted quirks. They wanted references to historical styles. They wanted color and humor and shapes that felt slightly chaotic, but still functional enough so no one panicked. If modernism was the clean, minimalist living room aesthetic, postmodernism was the room where someone added a bright purple pillow, a plant shaped like a pineapple,
and a bookshelf arranged by emotions rather than alphabet. New York dipped its toes into this pool with buildings like the AT&T Building, now the Sony Building, the Lipstick Building, 1986, the World Financial Center, 1988. These structures began reintroducing decorative tops, arches, or playful curves without fully diving back into the look at my sculpted lions and Corinthian columns phase. Let's float closer to one of the most iconic. The AT&T Building, the one with the Chippendale top. This building, designed by Philip Johnson, became a kind of postmodern celebrity. Completed in 1984, it was a skyscraper that wore a decorative top shaped like a broken pediment, similar to a Chippendale highboy dresser. Yes, a dresser. New York built a skyscraper that looks like fancy furniture. It was bold. It was mocked. It was praised. It was confusing. People either loved it or pretended they didn't. But it marked a turning point. Skyscrapers were allowed to be whimsical again. The building's granite facade gave it a solid, slightly old-school presence, while the ornamental crown reminded everyone that architecture was, at least occasionally, allowed to have a sense of humor, or fashion sense, or both. Postmodernism didn't dominate the skyline, but it sprinkled its influence here and there, like architectural seasoning. Let's drift on. The Lipstick Building. Yes, it really looks like a tube of lipstick. Another quiet star of postmodern New York is the Lipstick Building, completed in 1986. It's sleek, shiny, red, rounded, and tapers upwards in elliptical layers that really do make it look like a giant cosmetic product rising from 3rd Avenue. Architects Philip Johnson and John Berger designed it with playful curves that broke from the boxy monotony of previous decades. The building felt lighter, a little flirty, a little amused with itself. And in classic New York fashion, it housed both financial offices and, later on, Bernie Madoff's infamous firm, which honestly feels like exactly the kind of ironic plot twist New York architecture loves. Let's float onward. The World Financial Center. Corporate architecture with a soft smile. Across from the World Trade Center, the group of buildings known as the World Financial Center, now Brookfield Place, was completed between 1985 and 1988. Designed by César Peggy, the complex used granite, stepped forms, and geometric roof shapes, pyramids, domes, and sloped caps that softened the harsh angles of the city's earlier glass towers. These weren't decorative in an ancient Greece way, or a Beaux-Arts way, but more like gentle nods to the past. Friendly shapes. Shapes that felt comforting. Corporate, but cuddly. As cuddly as skyscrapers can get, anyway. This complex also created a new public space, the Winter Garden Atrium, with tall palm trees under a glass dome. Very dramatic, very tropical, very what if Manhattan had a greenhouse of financial relaxation. Let's drift into a slightly heavier architectural era, the Twin Towers era. Tall, minimalist, confident. No story of New York architecture is complete without the World Trade Center, specifically the original Twin Towers, completed between 1970 and 1973. The towers were textbook modernism: simple rectangular forms, repetitive vertical lines, lightweight steel tube structural design, minimal ornament, and a sense of quiet serenity, despite their huge scale. They were 1,368 feet and 1,362 feet tall, calm, understated, symbolic of modern confidence. And they dominated the skyline, a pair of identical giants, symmetrical and steady. We won't linger on the tragedy of their loss. You asked for gentle storytelling, and we'll keep it that way. But their architectural legacy shaped an entire era of New York's development. Let's drift ahead, quietly, into the era of rebirth. Rebuilding Lower Manhattan, a new generation of towers. After the early 2000s, architects faced the challenge of redesigning and rebuilding one of the world's most important urban spaces. The new One World Trade Center, completed in 2014 and designed by David Childs, rose as the centerpiece. It's a tall, shimmering glass tower with an 8-sided form that tapers elegantly as it climbs. Calm, reflective, almost meditative. Other buildings followed. 7 World Trade Center, the first completed after reconstruction, a simple but luminous glass tower. 3 World Trade Center with exoskeleton-inspired steel braces. 4 World Trade Center, sleek and minimalist, blending almost perfectly into the sky. Together, they form an ensemble that feels modern, understated, and respectful, without abandoning New York's architectural hunger for height. Let's keep floating. The glass boom, New York's obsession with transparency. By the 2000s and 2010s, something became clear. Glass towers were the new default setting. Developers loved them. Architects loved them. Residents tolerated them. Glass is modern. Glass feels open. And glass is very forgiving when you want a building to look expensive. Neighborhoods like Midtown, Hudson Yards, and Lower Manhattan exploded with new towers that shimmer like enormous smartphone screens. These buildings reflect each other, blend into the clouds, make sunsets look dramatic without trying, and occasionally confuse birds. Some notable examples include the Bank of America Tower, 2009, 157, 2014, the super tall pioneer of Billionaires Row, Hudson Yards Mega Towers, a whole family of shiny giants built on top of a rail yard because New York was out of land and decided to just build above the trains. Glass buildings often face criticism for being too reflective, too cold, too disconnected from the city's older architectural soul. But at night, they soften into glowing prisms, calm giants, quiet beacons. Let's float towards one of the most controversial trends. Billionaires Row, the pencil towers. Around the 2010s, architects discovered a fun little trick. If you make a building extremely thin and extremely tall, you can maximize the number of luxury apartments with skyline views. And so, pencil towers arrived. These towers, such as 432 Park Avenue, 11 West 57th Street, Central Park Tower, shoot into the sky like extremely proud, extremely expensive toothpicks. 432 is a minimalist square prism with perfectly symmetrical windows that make it look like a giant upscale cheese grater. It's 1,396 feet tall, but only about 90 feet wide. A true architectural overachiever. 115 West 57th.
If you're still awake after the last section, I'm honestly impressed. But let's gently drift forward, sliding into the late 19th century, where New York starts deciding that the old stone boxes vibe was cute, but it wanted to glow up. And by glow up, I mean build things so heavy, so ornate, and so unnecessarily dramatic that even modern New Yorkers would look at them and say, okay, that's a bit much. We're landing in that weird transitional era where industrialization is booming, millionaires are multiplying, and architectural taste is basically a loud argument between 5 different styles in one room. So, New York, as usual. Let's keep drifting. The city tries on a new aesthetic again. By the mid-1800s, New York had already cycled through enough architectural phases to qualify as chronically indecisive. It started with Dutch farmhouses, skipped over to Georgian manors, flirted with Gothic revival temples, dabbled in Gothic arches, and now it was time for yet another makeover. Enter the brownstone era. Yes, the brownstones. The ones you see in literally every rom-com where the protagonist somehow affords a 3-story townhouse on a barista salary. These homes became the backbone of New York domestic architecture. They weren't luxurious in the Gilded Age sense, but they were respectable, repetitive, and blessedly standard. In fact, they were so standardized that you could practically order one like a sandwich. 1 stoop, 3 floors, bay window on request, decorative lintels if you're feeling fancy. Brownstones were basically the IKEA of 19th century townhouses. Charming, cozy, mildly pretentious, and a little too easy to mass produce. But the facade, made from reddish-brown sandstone, became so iconic that the stone itself practically became a brand, a vibe, a personality trait. They weren't indestructible, though. Anyone who owns a brownstone today knows the sandstone ages about as gracefully as an overcooked cookie. But we accept them anyway because nostalgia is stronger than common sense. Meanwhile, downtown was doing a full industrial glow-up. Let's float down toward lower Manhattan again, the part of the city that never really sleeps except when Wall Street crashes. By the 1850s and 60s, industry was booming. Warehouses and commercial buildings started popping up everywhere, like mushrooms with better credit scores. And this is where iron, and later steel, start to make their debut. Cast iron architecture becomes the hot new trend. And nowhere does it flourish harder than Soho. Today's land of overpriced lofts, art galleries you pretend to understand, and restaurants that serve 3 ravioli for $68. But back then, it was an industrial paradise of cast iron facades. Lightweight, moldable, and perfect for showing off. If stone was the architectural equivalent of a stable long-term partner, cast iron was that exciting new fling who convinced you to try bangs. Entire building fronts were made from cast iron poured into molds, meaning architects could go wild with ornamental designs. Columns, cornices, frills, cherubs, whatever. It was like Victorian lace, but on buildings. Of course, cast iron has the tragic flaw of expanding during fires and collapsing walls like soggy cake, but hey, aesthetic over safety, New York tradition. Then came the Gilded Age, where restraint went to die. All right, now we start drifting toward the Gilded Age, the era when rich people actively competed to see who could build the biggest monument to their own ego. This is the period when architecture says, oh, subtlety? Never heard of her. We're talking marble mansions, gold leaf on everything, staircases that existed solely so someone could dramatically descend them during a party. Let's glide down Fifth Avenue, the Gilded Age's favorite runway. Millionaires like the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, Astors, and basically anyone who owned a railroad or a monopoly started building homes so large that calling them houses feels rude. These were palaces, French chateaux transplanted into Manhattan's grid like someone misclicked while playing a city-building game. One of the most ridiculous examples? The Vanderbilt Triple Palace. Because apparently one mansion wasn't enough, they decided to build 3 next to each other, like an overachieving cul-de-sac. Another famous one, the William K. Vanderbilt House, also known as the Petite Chateau, which, to no one's surprise, was not petite. It looked like a Renaissance nobleman tried to cosplay as a Manhattanite. These mansions symbolized wealth at a level that bordered on performance art. And let's be honest, most of these families were trying too hard. The Nouveau Riche wanted everyone to know that they had money now, thank you very much, even if their architectural sense was basically, what if we glued 4 European castles together? But New York's Gilded Age had a twist. Everything was temporary. Here's the irony. Most of these mansions, these overbuilt, overly ornamented showpieces, they're gone, demolished, leveled, replaced by apartments, office buildings, or honestly just better ideas. It turns out the only thing more ruthless than a Gilded Age millionaire is Manhattan real estate. The land became so valuable so quickly that no matter how many cherubs or carved marble balustrades you had, they were one zoning change away from oblivion. By the 1920s, the palaces of Fifth Avenue were vanishing faster than a New Yorker who sees a street canvasser with a clipboard. Only a few survive today, like the Frick Collection, originally Henry Clay Frick's I'm Rich and Angry mansion, the Carnegie Mansion, now the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and the Ukrainian Institute, formerly the stoutly elegant Fletcher Mansion. Everything else? Gone. Poof. History dust. But this cycle, build it, worship it, bulldoze it, is kind of New York's architectural love language. Let's float to Brooklyn for a moment. Before we get too Manhattan-centric, Brooklyn deserves a quiet moment of appreciation. While Manhattan was busy having an architectural identity crisis every 10 years, Brooklyn was like that stable friend who quietly gets their life together without making a big show of it. Brooklyn grew through the 19th century in a much more grounded, organized way. Neighborhoods like Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, Cobble Hill, and Park Slope became showcases of refined row houses, brownstone cousins that were a little softer, a little more residential, and honestly more photogenic. Even Brooklyn Heights especially became a kind of peaceful haven. It had the city's first suburb vibes, tree-lined streets, cohesive architecture, and none of the chaotic screaming energy of Manhattan. Even today, you can walk through those neighborhoods and feel that 19th century stillness, at least when someone isn't walking their off-leash Pold'n-Doodle. New York's churches were like the drama queens of architecture. While all this was happening, religious buildings were like, hey, we can be extra too. New York ends up with an entire collection of Gothic revival churches, each trying to out-Gothic the next. The most famous? St. Patrick's Cathedral. You've definitely seen it, sitting right across from Rockefeller Center, basically holding its ground while skyscrapers loom over it like impatient teenagers. Construction started in the 1850s, paused because the Civil War said nope, and then resumed until completion in the 1870s. The design was unapologetically Gothic. Spires, pointed arches, stained glass, and enough carved details to keep stonemasons employed for a decade. Another example, Trinity Church at Wall Street. This one predates St. Patrick's and sat proudly at the foot of Wall Street like a holy speed bump in front of capitalism. Churches in New York from this era weren't just buildings, they were statements. Spiritual, yes, but also, look at us, we can do Europe too. And now, the real game changer. The birth of the skyscraper. Okay, this is where we gently shift into New York's architectural puberty. Because up until now, buildings were basically short kings. Cute, ornate, respectable, but limited. Then steel arrived. Elevators improved, and New York collectively said, what if we go up? Skyscrapers weren't born in New York. Chicago beat them to it. But New York absolutely made them famous and adopted them with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new personality trait. One of the first major examples was the New York World Building in the 1890s. It wasn't the prettiest, but it was tall, and that's all New York needed to start the obsession. Then came the Flatiron Building in 1902. Ah yes, the triangle, the architectural slice of pizza, the building that looks perpetually wind-burned. It was weird for its time, tall, skinny, and shaped like someone forgot to finish the blueprint.
Let's drift into the early 20th century, where height becomes an existential necessity, and architects are just doing their best not to break anything important. The 1900s. The city realizes steel is basically a cheat code. So, it's around 1900, and New York is in full industrial adolescent phase. It's growing, it's moody, it's stressed, it's got too many people and not enough space. And like every dramatic teenager, it turns the pressure into a bold, irrational solution. Skyscrapers. Steel frame construction becomes mainstream. Improved elevators stop plunging people to their doom, which is always a plus. And suddenly, architects are no longer limited by the physics that imprisoned their ancestors. It's not that gravity stops mattering, it's just negotiable now. The Fuller Building, better known as the Flatiron Building, pops up in 1902 to say hello. It's only 285 feet tall, but it's memorable because it looks like someone tried to build a slice of cheese into the fabric of Manhattan. New Yorkers were obsessed with it. Photographers loved it. Architects debated it. People said the winds around the pointy end blew skirts upward. The police told men to stop loitering on the corner because of that. Everyone else just kept loitering anyway. Even today, it has that quiet confidence of a building that knows it shouldn't work, but does anyway. Then the Woolworth Building arrives and says, "Bow before me." In 1913, the Woolworth Building shows up like the overachiever of the class. It's tall, it's ornate, it's basically Gothic architecture on steroids. Frank W. Woolworth, yes, the five and dime guy, paid for it in cash. Because apparently when you underpay 1 million teenagers to sweep your stores, you get to build a skyscraper as a treat. The Woolworth Building becomes the tallest building in the world at 792 feet. Its lobby is a glowing temple of marble, mosaics, and enough golden detail to convince you that maybe capitalism is a religion. The building is elegant, beautiful, and somehow still a little smug. It knows it's important. It stood as the world's tallest until the mid-1930s, but we'll get to the next contenders in a bit. For now, just admire the irony. The most dignified skyscraper in New York was funded by cheap household goods. But first, let's glide to the other boroughs for a moment. Before the skyscraper madness takes over everything, the rest of New York is busy doing its own architectural homework. Brooklyn. Brooklyn is expanding. Neighborhoods like Prospect Heights, Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, and Bay Ridge start solidifying their character with row houses, pre-war apartments, and quiet blocks that age surprisingly well. Brooklyn architecture in this period is mostly brick, limestone, modest ornamentation, the occasional random turret because someone got creative. In short, reliable, predictable,
a stable relationship. Queens is still farmland in many pockets, but it's beginning to sprout early 20th century suburban-style homes. Think detached houses, pitched roofs, porches, the kind of aesthetic that whispers, "We own a lawnmower." It's extremely undramatic, and honestly, that's refreshing after Manhattan's chaos. The Bronx is quietly becoming a dense grid of apartment buildings, many of them pre-war, sturdy, practical, and surprisingly handsome in that clean, early modernist way. Staten Island is doing Staten Island things, mostly existing. But this is the moment when New York starts to feel like a real five-borough city, even if Manhattan gets all the architectural attention like the spoiled oldest sibling. Back to Manhattan. Art Deco walks in like a diva. Let's drift into the early 1920s and early 1930s. The vibe is glitzy, optimistic, and desperately trying not to think about economic collapse. Art Deco becomes the architectural language of ambition. It's sleek, it's symmetrical, it loves geometric patterns. It's what happens when you mix ancient Egyptian motives with machine-age confidence. And New York gobbles it up. This is the era that gives the city some of its most iconic silhouettes. Buildings that basically define the skyline for the next century. Let's take them one at a time, slowly, like we're examining ancient relics in a quiet museum. The Chrysler Building, New York's shiny overachiever. Completed in 1930, the Chrysler Building is basically Art Deco royalty. It's shiny, it's pointy, it sparkles like a disco ball that went to finishing school. Walter Chrysler, the car guy, wanted a skyscraper that would scream elegance, power, and "I can afford this." The crown is its most famous feature. 7 layers of steel arches with triangular windows arranged like sunbursts. It looks like a stainless steel tiara built for a very specific kind of futurist queen. Then there are the gargoyles shaped like Chrysler car ornaments, because of course there are. The building was briefly the tallest in the world, but because this is New York, another challenger basically popped up immediately. Still, the Chrysler Building remains one of the prettiest things in the city. It's dramatic without trying too hard. Tall, but not obnoxiously so. Elegant, but not snobby. The perfect Art Deco supermodel. And then, the Empire State Building arrives to win the whole game. In 1931, New York says, "Enough messing around." The Empire State Building appears. Tall, stoic, classic, like a skyscraper that lifts weights in the morning and reads poetry at night. The Empire State Building reaches 1,250 feet, over 200 feet taller than the Chrysler Building, and takes the world's tallest crown. And it keeps that title for roughly 40 years. It's built astonishingly fast, just over a year, because apparently labor laws and safety regulations were just adorable suggestions back then. The design is clean, streamlined, minimal compared to the exuberance of the Chrysler crown. It's Art Deco, but the more disciplined version, the architectural equivalent of someone who wakes up at 5 a.m. to meditate. When it first opens, it's massively unoccupied because the Great Depression shows up like an unexpected guest and ruins the party. People even joke that the building is so empty it should be called the Empty State Building. But over time, it becomes the symbol of New York ambition, a kind of architectural exhale, a quiet assertion that the city is always looking forward, even during crises. Skyscrapers become a lifestyle. By the 1930s, New York fully embraces vertical living and working. It stops being a novelty and becomes a necessity.
Buildings like 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the Daily News Building, the American Radiator Building, and dozens of lesser-known Art Deco towers start defining Midtown and parts of downtown with a kind of confident elegance. These structures aren't just tall, they're expressive. They taper, they step back. They incorporate the 1916 zoning laws that forced skyscrapers to get slimmer as they rose, giving New York's iconic wedding cake skyline. It's practical architectural sculpting. Also, it looks really cool. Let's gently glide into post-World War II modernism. After World War II, New York undergoes another architectural personality shift. Art Deco bows out, International style walks in wearing a plain black turtleneck and holding a minimalist coffee. This style is boxy, glass-heavy, steel-framed, allergic to ornamentation, basically the architectural equivalent of "I don't smile in pictures." And honestly, it fits the mid-20th century vibe a little too well. One of the biggest pioneers of this new aesthetic, Lever House, completed in 1952. It's a sleek glass slab floating over an open plaza. It looks simple now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Then comes the giant, the Seagram Building in 1958. Designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, it's a masterpiece of precision. Every line, every proportion, every bronze-tinted window, perfectly intentional. It's the kind of building that whispers, "I am sophisticated. Please don't touch my facade." These glass and steel towers set a new tone for Manhattan. Suddenly, everyone wants curtain walls, rectangles, sleek modernist austerity. The skyline becomes sharper, colder, more geometric. Some people love it, others miss the ornamentation of the earlier decades. But this is New York. It evolves whether anyone agrees or not. Mid-century housing projects, the utopias that weren't. Let's drift into the city's experiment with urban renewal, a phrase that should always be whispered with mild suspicion. In the 1950s and 60s, planners decide that dense old neighborhoods should be replaced by modern high-rise housing projects. The intention is noble, the execution is chaotic. Famous examples include Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, Co-op City, the various NYHC developments scattered across the boroughs. They're simple, uniform, functional, but also kind of...
Let's settle back in. Maybe pull your blanket up a little higher. Because we're floating into the late 20th century, one of New York's most chaotic architectural identity crises. You'd think after a century of skyscraper drama, the city would calm down a bit. But no, New York is like, what if we tried everything and also did it loudly? So tonight, we ease into the era where architects decide modernism is too boring, too boxy, too rectangular. And then postmodernism walks in with way too much confidence and says, let's put a hat on this building, and also a fake classical column, and maybe a pointless curve, because why not? Let's drift through it, nice and slow. The 1970s. New York tries to pretend everything is fine. The 1970s were rough. Crime is up. Budgets are down. The city is basically living off stress and caffeine. And architecture? Well, it's doing a kind of quiet panic. Development slows to a crawl. Historic structures get bulldozed because people aren't really thinking about preservation yet. Buildings become more utilitarian, more please don't fall apart than please admire me. And yet, in the middle of all this gloom, a few major icons are born. World Trade Center, the minimalist giants. The original Twin Towers, completed in 1973, rise out of lower Manhattan like two very tall, very serious siblings. Designed by Minoru Yamakasi, they're sleek and simple, rectangular prisms with delicate vertical lines, almost skeletal in appearance. Some people loved them. Others thought they were cold, even unfriendly. But whatever your opinion, they reshaped the skyline like nothing before. The towers were so tall they made every other skyscraper feel mildly insecure. Inside, the floors were vast open plates, made possible by a brilliant engineering trick. All the structural support was pushed to the outer walls and the core. This was revolutionary. It was also a little disorienting. Huge floors with endless indoor horizons. Outside, they mirrored the sky, clouds, and light. Simple, serious. New York in its concentrated form. We're not discussing 2001 here. That's not the vibe for tonight. We're focusing on construction, design, and presence. And architecturally speaking, the Twin Towers were a turning point. They were the capstone of the international style era, the moment when minimalism got as tall as it possibly could. But modernism was getting boring, so postmodernism shows up in a sequin jacket. Let's slide into the 1980s now. Disco is fading, Wall Street is rising, and architects are getting tired of boxes. The international style had been the dominant aesthetic for decades, and it was starting to feel like every building was cosplaying as a shoebox. People wanted personality again, flair, or at least a little visual relief. Thus enters postmodernism, the architectural version of saying, I reject minimalism and embrace weirdness. Postmodern buildings often mix historical references, add playful shapes, use bold colors, break symmetry on purpose, and look vaguely like they were designed after 3 espressos and a dare. New York doesn't hold back. AT&T Building, the one with the fancy pediment haircut. Completed in 1984, the AT&T Building, now 550 Madison Avenue, becomes the poster child for American postmodernism. Designed by Philip Johnson and John Berge, it famously features a broken pediment at the top, a classical shape usually found on furniture or temples, except here it's been blown up to skyscraper scale. Critics at the time were divided. Some said it was refreshing, others said it looked like an enormous Chippendale highboy. Today, people look at it fondly, like a fashionable aunt who wore bizarre outfits in the 1980s, but somehow pulled them off. The building marks a shift. Ornamentation was back. Symbolism was back. Playfulness was back. And New York, as usual, had opinions. Lipstick Building. Yes, it looks like lipstick. In 1986, Philip Johnson delivers another icon, the Lipstick Building. It's sleek, curved, red granite and steel, tapered like, well, lipstick. The nickname sticks so hard that most people forget the actual address. It stands out because it's unapologetically odd, yet strangely elegant. It also gains a bit of infamy later because Bernie Madoff's operation was headquartered inside. But that's a different story, and not exactly soothing bedtime material. But architecturally, though, It's a perfect example of postmodern New York. Quirky, self-aware, and a little too proud of its own metaphor. The 1990s. Glass towers, corporate chic, and a touch of existential confusion. Now let's drift into the 1990s, an era of financial optimism, less crime, and cleaner streets. Architecture shifts again. Postmodern whimsy fades, corporate gloss rises, and developers want reflective glass, sharp corners, fewer jokes in the facade, something that whispers, "We do quarterly earnings reports." Buildings like 4 Times Square, Worldwide Plaza, Bear Stearns Building start defining Midtown with a sleeker, more polished aesthetic. These are not flamboyant buildings. They're respectable, safe. They would wear a navy suit if they were human. The city is preparing for its next transformation, one that will involve global brands, star architects, and a lot of glass. The 2000s. A city redefines itself again. After 2001, New York enters a new architectural chapter, one shaped by resilience, memory, and renewal. The decision to rebuild Lower Manhattan triggers one of the most complex architectural processes in modern history. Competitions, public debates, political arguments, design revisions upon revisions. Eventually, a plan emerges for the new World Trade Center site centered on One World Trade Center, the 9/11 Memorial, the 9/11 Museum, WTC Transit Hub, and several additional towers. This becomes the heart of 21st century architectural New York. Let's glide through these quietly, one by one. One World Trade Center. Tall, calm, and symbolic. Completed in 2014, One World Trade Center rises to a symbolic 1,776 feet, a gentle nod to American history. Design-wise, it's elegant. A shimmering glass prism, tapering as it rises, rotating slightly, catching the sky in 1,000 shifting reflections. It's modern, but not flashy. Tall, but serene. It's not trying to show off. It's trying to stand steady. Inside, the building is extremely high-tech, heavily reinforced and designed with security in mind. It's basically the responsible eldest sibling of the skyline. Light, calm, dignified. It restores height to the skyline without returning to the rectangular minimalism of the past. The 9/11 Memorial. Architecture as stillness. Next to the tower sit the 2 memorial pools, massive voids marking the footprints of the original Twin Towers. Water falls down into each square, vanishing into a smaller central void. The sound is soft, steady, almost meditative. The design is minimalist, but emotional. Architect Michael Arad called it reflecting absence, and that silence, that emptiness, becomes a form of architecture itself. It's one of the few places in New York where people naturally whisper. WTC Transit Hub, the big white bird that everyone has opinions about. Designed by Santiago Calatrava, the Transit Hub, often called the Oculus, is one of those projects that goes wildly over budget, takes years longer than expected, and ends up being oddly beloved. Its shape is dramatic. All white ribs stretching upward like a skeletal bird in flight, or a prehistoric creature mid-molt, depending on your mood. Inside, it's a glowing white cavern of marble and light. People take photos there constantly. Architectural purists complain. Commuters shrug. Tourists adore it. It's one of the most distinctive structures built in modern New York. Now we drift into the era of super skinny skyscrapers. Around the 2010s, architects and developers find a new obsession, building extremely tall residential towers that are also extremely narrow, like pencil thin, gravity-defying, and are we sure this is allowed? Thin. This is Billionaire's Row, the stretch of 57th Street that becomes a laboratory for modern engineering. Buildings like 432 Park Avenue, 111 West 57th Street, 53 West 53, 157 turn Midtown into a forest of shimmering, ultra-skinny giants. Let's float through them. 432 Park Avenue. The face only minimalism could love. Completed in 2015, 432 Park is a tall, pale grid, an enormous white rectangle stretching into the clouds. It's extremely minimalist. Some say too minimalist. It looks like someone hit stretch on a modernist apartment building in Photoshop. But the engineering is wild. The building is so thin that it has giant open mechanical floors to let wind pass through so it doesn't sway too dramatically. Inside, apartments cost tens of millions. They have views of everything: Central Park, rivers, bridges, the curvature of the earth, if you squint hard enough. It's a love it or hate it building, no in between. 111 West 57th Street, the pretty pencil. This one is a showstopper. Completed in 2021, it's the skinniest skyscraper in the world, with a width-to-height ratio of about 1:24. It's basically a needle wrapped in terracotta and bronze. Delicate, elegant, like an Art Deco skyscraper that got stretched in the wash. The tower rises behind the historic Steinway Hall, creating a striking contrast between early 20th century ornament and modern slenderness. It's a building that whispers, "I'm glamorous. Do not approach me unless you earn passive income." 53 West 53, the angular one. Attached to the Museum of Modern Art, 53 West 53, designed by Jean Nouvel, is an angular, shadowy tower with exposed structural diagonals. It looks like a futuristic shard, moody, sharp, like a skyscraper in a sci-fi movie that's always about to rain. It's very dramatic, but quietly dramatic. Perfect bedtime architecture. Hudson Yards, the newest architectural overachievement. Let's glide over to the west side now, where Hudson Yards has been rising since the 2010s. This project is enormous. It's like someone took a chunk of Dubai and gently lowered it onto Manhattan. Hudson Yards includes glass office towers, luxury condos, a giant mall, the vessel, the shed, the moving building, lots of reflective surfaces, the vague scent of money. The architecture is modern, shiny, and a bit corporate, but undeniably ambitious. The vessel, now closed to the public, is a honeycomb-shaped stairway sculpture. It looks like a beehive that got a personal trainer. The shed is a cultural center with a roof that slides open like a giant air purifier. It's one of the most interesting modern buildings in the city. Hudson Yards showcases a new direction in New York architecture. Hypermodern, tech-forward, globally influenced, aggressively glossy. The trend of adaptive reuse. Old buildings get a second life. Not everything is glass and billionaires. New York is also quietly preserving and reimagining older buildings. Examples include Chelsea Market in a former biscuit factory, the High Line, a park built on an abandoned elevated railway, Industry City in old warehouses, the Domino Sugar Refinery redevelopment in Williamsburg. Adaptive reuse becomes a gentle trend that softens the city's edges. It's sustainable, thoughtful, and surprisingly cozy. Contemporary New York, a mix of every era.
Today's skyline is a layered tapestry. Colonial relics, brownstones, Gothic churches, cast-iron facades, Art Deco giants, modernist glass boxes, postmodern oddities, super-tall needles, public sculpture, and new parks built over old railroads. It's chaotic, contradictory, frequently confusing, and yet unmistakable. New York's architecture isn't about perfection. It's about energy, ambition, reinvention. It's a city that builds over itself, learns from itself, forgets itself, and then remembers again. It's messy, loud, beautiful in a crooked, stubborn way, and somehow all of it makes sense together, like a giant architectural collage.
Let's tuck ourselves deeper under the covers, slow our breathing, and drift into the final stretch of our nighttime journey. We've walked through centuries now. Dutch outposts, brownstone dreams, Art Deco crowns, glass needles, weird curvy postmodern skyscrapers that look like fancy furniture, and the quiet power of memorials. But now we arrive at the big question. Why does New York look the way it does? Why does it feel like a living encyclopedia of architectural moods? Why does the skyline make your chest feel full, your neck hurt from looking up, and your head spin just a tiny bit? Let's explore that. Gently. Softly. The way a historian talks at 3 a.m. when all the footnotes and caffeine have worn off. New York is a city built by waves, not plans. Most cities grow with a plan, a blueprint, an idea of what we want this place to feel like. Not New York. New York is built in bursts. Each era leaves a layer. 1600s, wooden houses and Dutch practicality. 1800s, brownstones, churches, mercantile facades. Late 1800s, cast iron experiments and gilded excess. Early 1900s, steel frames and decorative ambition. 1920s through 30s, Art Deco glory. 1950s through 70s, glass boxes, urban renewal, and highways that should not have been built. 1980s through 90s, postmodern quirks. 21st century to now, super talls, shimmering glass, and adaptive reuse. Each wave doesn't erase the last. It just stacks on top. Like sedimentary rock made of brick, steel, and questionable zoning decisions. The result feels accidental, organic, chaotic in a lovable way. New York's architecture isn't united by style, it's united by momentum. Ambition is the city's only real style. Think about it. Every building in New York, whether it's a brownstone, a skyscraper, or a warehouse, has one thing in common. It was built because someone wanted more. Space, money, status, more people, more opportunity, more density, more height, more light, more rooms to rent, more places to work, more things to store, more air rights to sell. The city's architecture is the physical evidence of endless ambition. Even when the styles change, the instinct remains the same. A brownstone says, I want a home big enough to impress my 19th century neighbors. The Empire State Building says, I want to touch the sky before anyone else does. A billionaire's row tower whispers, I want to be thin, tall, expensive, and mildly terrifying. The High Line says, I want beauty where there used to be rust. Ambition is the through line. Not aesthetics, not symmetry, not order. Ambition is the city's architectural DNA. New York has no fear of contradictions. Most cities pick a vibe. Paris, elegant stone and mansard roofs. Tokyo, neon futurism mixed with tiny traditional pockets. London, restrained, orderly, polite. Rome, marble past and ochre present. New York? New York is the city equivalent of someone wearing fancy shoes, basketball shorts, a suit jacket, and sunglasses indoors. And somehow it works. You walk down a single street and see a Greek Revival townhouse, a 1970s slab, an 1890s cast iron facade, a 2020s glass condo tower, a deli with a flickering sign, a Starbucks jammed into a former bank. It shouldn't match. It shouldn't flow. But it does. Because contradiction is the flow. New York's skyline is a collage made by 1,000 different people with 1,000 different ideas. And the only thing stitching it together is the energy of the city itself. Density forces innovation, even when nobody wants it. New York builds upward not because it wants to, but because it has to. Manhattan is tiny. 7 miles long, 2 miles wide at its thickest. A little pebble next to the Atlantic Ocean. But millions of people want to live here. Millions more want to work here. Millions more want to visit here. So what do? You can't expand sideways. You expand up. Height isn't decoration. It's survival. It's economic pressure turned into steel beams and elevator shafts. Every zoning law, every setback, every weird triangular building that makes you wonder if the architect was sleep-deprived, it all comes from trying to fit too much life into too little space. New York's verticality is a response to scarcity. A beautiful, chaotic response, but still, necessity, more than whimsy. The skyline is a mirror of capital. This part isn't romantic, but it's real. New York's architecture follows money like a compass. Shipping money builds warehouses. Merchant money builds brownstones. Industrial money builds factories. Gilded Age money builds Beaux-Arts palaces. Roaring 20s money builds Art Deco skyscrapers. Mid-century corporate money builds glass boxes. 21st century global wealth builds super talls. Those skinny towers on 57th Street, they're not built because New York needs more housing. They're built because the global elite wants safe places to store capital. The High Line, it made West Chelsea real estate skyrocket. Hudson Yards, corporate ambition in the form of mirrored glass. The skyline is capitalism rendered in architecture. Not good, not bad, just true. But money isn't the only force here. There are other layers, deeper ones, quieter ones. What people forget is that New York's architecture is also personal. Architecture isn't just steel and design, it's emotional memory. People fall in love in front of buildings. People mourn in front of them. People walk past the same doorway every day for decades. People argue on stoops. People watch the skyline change from their window and feel a strange ache. Someone's first apartment, someone's last office job, someone's favorite bridge in Central Park, someone's secret bench, someone's fire escape where they used to smoke and think about life. You can't tear down a building, but you can't tear down what it meant. This is why preservation matters, why fights erupt over landmarks, why everyone has an opinion when a new tower goes up. The skyline is not just a picture, it's a collective memory. New York doesn't just build, it rebuilds. If you look closely, the city is always repairing itself. Renovating, repurposing, reinforcing, reimagining. Fire escapes added, windows replaced.
We're settling into the very last, very quiet stretch now. The part of the night where the world feels muffled and even New York seems to exhale a little. Even the honking taxis sound like they're getting tired. So let's take a few final steps together through the city's architectural soul. Not the big monuments, not the skyline celebrities, just the smaller, softer details, the ones you only notice when your mind is slow and your eyes are wandering and you're walking without any particular destination. The kind of details that make you think, oh, right, someone built this. New York's tiny architectural secrets. When you're fully awake, the city overwhelms you. But in this late-hour, half-dream state, small things begin to stand out. The carved stone owl perched above a library doorway. The old iron boot scraper next to a brownstone stoop. The terracotta faces that stare down from tenement cornices, all frozen in expressions that seem mildly disappointed by modern life. You notice the ornate railing on a forgotten balcony, or the faint outline of a painted advertisement that once promised hair tonic, or biscuits, or miracle cures for everything except existential dread. New York is full of architectural whispers. little leftovers from eras that thought they were permanent, eras that had no idea they'd eventually become trivia. Those tiny details are the quiet proof that the city was never built all at once. It was stitched together one brick, one cornice, one questionable design choice at a time. The sleepy genius of fire escapes. Here at the end of the night, let's give a moment of respect to one of New York's most iconic, unglamorous architectural quirks, the fire escape. They lean on buildings like tired metal skeletons. They're legally required, structurally odd, and visually inconsistent, but somehow beautiful in their own scrappy way. At dusk, they catch warm sunlight. At night, they hold memories of music drifting from open windows. They've hosted first kisses, breakups, cigarette breaks, cooling pies, and dramatic internal monologues. No one ever designs a building hoping the fire escape will be the star of the facade. But in New York, it often becomes the accidental poetry on an otherwise plain wall. If architecture has a supporting actor award, the fire escape deserves it, preferably handed over by an underappreciated tenement. Sidewalks as architectural artifacts. Even the sidewalks deserve credit. They're not glamorous, but they're printed with time. Some slabs still have the names of century-old concrete companies stamped into the corners, little signatures of workers who never imagined anyone would notice. Some squares hide purple glass prisms, remnants of 1800s vault lights that once illuminated the basements below. Some sidewalks tilt just enough to remind you that the city is built on landfill, mud, rock, imagination, and occasionally very poor planning. Every crack, every repair patch, every slightly misaligned paving stone is a reminder that New York is always quietly shifting under you. The bridges at night. Then there are the bridges. During the day, bridges feel like infrastructure. Functional. Necessary. Fine. But at night? At night, they're cathedrals of steel. The Brooklyn Bridge stands with the calm confidence of something that survived more than it should have. Its cables make perfect lines against the sky. Lines that somehow feel both mathematical and emotional. The Manhattan Bridge glows a little colder, like it's trying to convince you it's the mature older sibling. The Williamsburg Bridge tries to look tough, but is secretly charming. The Queensboro Bridge is the eccentric uncle with too many stories and a metal skeleton that looks tired but refuses to retire. Bridges are architecture at its most philosophical. They exist because humans looked at a stretch of water and said, I'd rather not go around. And New York's bridges in particular whisper a simple late-night truth. Connection is the whole point. Streetlights, shadows, and that one window that never turns off. As the city quiets, the architecture begins to glow in a softer way. Streetlights light up cornices and sidewalk edges. Car headlights glide across facades like slow-moving ghosts. The city becomes a gallery of accidental lighting design. Some buildings look more dramatic at 2 a.m. than they ever do at noon. You notice which windows stay lit all night, tiny rectangles of life floating in the dark grid. Someone is awake.
Someone is working late, or just can't sleep, or forgot to turn the lamp off. Even that becomes part of the architecture at this hour. New York's buildings feel alive because they borrow their light from the people inside. The stillness of parks that are rarely still. Even Central Park, that great green architectural illusion, changes at night. By day, it's joyful chaos. Joggers, picnickers, tourists, overly confident squirrels. At night, it becomes a soft silhouette. The skyline glows above it, the trees stand quietly like they're resting, and the rocks look like old giants taking naps. The park's design, its curves, its paths, its bridges, feels more deliberate when the city is hushed. You can feel the 19th century idealism baked into the landscape. Olmsted wanted a place where you could breathe, and at this hour, the park finally gets to breathe, too. Buildings you only appreciate when it's late. There are always a few buildings in New York you never notice until you're tired, quiet, and walking home. The Art Deco apartment block with its geometric entryway. The tiny church squeezed between two towers like someone forgot it was there. The pre-war building with the gargoyles you somehow missed for 10 years. The little corner store with a surprisingly elegant cornice. The old hotel that looks like it has 1,000 stories but isn't in the mood to tell any of them. New York rewards the sleepless. It saves some beauty for the people who take the long way home. Why the city feels different when you're tired? At night, when your brain is slow, the architecture stops being impressive and starts being human. You see the labor behind it, the craft, the choices, the compromises, the forgotten hopes of long-gone architects who really believed the building they designed would change the world, or at least win an award. New York architecture is a patchwork of human limitations, and somehow that makes it more comforting. The city as a bedtime story. So as we drift toward the end, here's the softest truth about New York. It's not the buildings that make the city. It's the layers of life poured into them. The skyline is impressive. The towers are awe-inspiring. The history is rich. But the heart of New York's architecture is in the quiet moments. A lit window, a shadow on a facade, a forgotten detail above a doorway, a creak in a fire escape, a bridge glowing over dark water.